Protests have erupted across Ukraine after President Volodymyr Zelensky's government reshuffle removed Defense Minister Mykhailo Fedorov after just 6 months in office. Now, demonstrators like these in the capital, Kyiv, that you're seeing on your screen now, say Fedorov has been a central figure behind the military's modernisation efforts and recent successes in expanding Ukraine's drone and defence capabilities. Now, they argue the decision to dismiss Fedorov at this stage in the war sends the wrong message to Russia. President Zelenskyy has not yet explained the decision, but Ukrainian media have been reporting that there was a conflict between Fedorov and senior military heads. In fact, Fedorov publicly announced his dismissal on X, where he listed his achievements. He wrote that his team had, quote, initiated an unpopular but vital transformation of the military and had improved drone and cruise missile interception rates, among other achievements, which you can see there on your screen. Now, it's unclear for now who will replace him, but among the possible names being floated to take over the post are Interior Minister Ihor Klimenko. The reshuffle also included the nomination of the CEO of the state-owned energy company Naftogaz, Sergei Koretsky, as Prime Minister, a move that has now been approved by Parliament. All right, well, let's go to Kyiv now and our correspondent there, Nick Connolly. Nick, great to see you. So these protests appear to have emerged pretty quickly after Fedorov's dismissal. So how significant is the public reaction?
Look, I think this is difficult to overstate because, after all, this is only the second protest of this kind since this war began. Ukrainian society, even if they do not approve of what Zelenskyy is doing, has for the most part decided not to rock the boat during wartime and to basically pause all the kind of internal politics until this war is at least stabilized, frozen in some kind of way, if not fully resolved. But the fact that they're going out now means that they think this is going to directly affect Ukraine's ability to fight. Fedorov has only been in the job for 6 months. Before that, he was in charge of digitalization, created Ukraine's basically government app that allows you to do everything from getting married to doing your taxes on a very convenient app that also has been pretty stable and safe, despite all of Russia's attempts to hack it and to destroy it and take all those databases down. So this is a guy that comes into the job with a track record and kind of social, societal support. And there's a real sense now that this is basically the old system, the old way of doing things, fighting back against an attempt to change everything. And there's also a generational conflict between these generals who are all in their 50s and 60s and someone who is Ukraine's youngest ever minister, defense minister, someone who's in his 30s, and who is basically trying to rip up the rule book that was there before and take a different kind of war to Russia. The kind of thing you hear time and time again, people will tell you, if Ukraine is going to be fighting like a small Soviet army, we can't beat Russia as a big Soviet army. The only way we can win is by being different, by being high-tech, by being more efficient, and by questioning everything that we do.
Nick, as you're speaking there, we're seeing images of those protests that are taking place in Ukraine. Could you tell us what the signs are saying? Because I don't speak Ukrainian and I can't read Ukrainian, obviously.
So there is a very big diversity of signs out on the square. This is the same square where those anti-corruption protesters were last year, just outside Zelensky's office. Lots of the signs are unquotable because they're not very polite towards Zelensky, towards his leadership, but there were people with signs saying, "Where is your conscience?" Other people saying, "This is a holiday for Russia." Fedorov's sacking is basically going to make Russia's job a whole lot easier. There were people holding up pieces of drone that had been shot down, saying to us, to our camera, that under Fedorov we've been shooting a lot more of these drones down, and that is all going to change if he loses his job. So let's have a listen to what they had to say when they were speaking to our DW Ukrainian team earlier today.
Thanks to him, less of this kind of rubbish got through to us. That's why I've brought this piece of Iran drone with me, to keep him in his job.
I am outraged. I'm lost for words. It's a wider problem in the army and in politics. The old, ineffective system resists any change. Whenever an effective person comes up, be it an effective manager or an effective officer, they try to get rid of them.
офіцер, то його намагаються звільнити.
I think Fedorov was trying to cut off the corruption that I'm certain exists within the Ministry of Defense. Obviously, that didn't go down well with many people in the system, which is why they're trying to get him out.
We have all been fighting for digitalization to start in the military, for an end to corruption and for someone to get to the bottom of what's actually happening in the military. When Fedorov got the job, all that started happening. So for me, this protest is not primarily about him. It's about the changes in the army that everyone wanted so badly.
Fedorov is the Minister of Defense who actually changed the course of this war. The soldiers and society are on his side. He dismantled all the corrupt schemes that existed before his time. That's why his resignation is a cause for celebration for the Russians.
So that last sentiment that this is a gift to Vladimir Putin, to Russia, that their job is going to be a whole lot easier without Mykhailo Fedorov in charge of Ukraine's army, that's pretty widespread. And it isn't as strange sounding as you might think, especially if you look at Russian Telegram, those pro-war military bloggers who are often very much in favour of this war, but sometimes criticise Russia's army and its organisation. They are all pretty happy, and they're saying this is a minister who really has made Ukraine a whole lot more dangerous to Russia's army, and him being gone gives them hope that what we've recently seen, these attacks on Russia's oil facilities, Russian frontline positions being deprived of their logistics, that might all now be basically driven back, that Russia will have a second chance at a summer offensive here in Ukraine.
Now, Nick, President Zelenskyy has yet to publicly explain why Fedorov was removed, but Fedorov said in a press conference that he had declined Zelensky's offer to become his advisor. Does that then suggest that there are deeper disagreements with Zelenskyy or the military leadership? What's your take?
So what it seems to have been about was a bust-up between Fedorov as Minister of Defense and then Ukraine's top general, that is Alexander Syrsky, who is someone of a different generation, someone who comes from a totally different kind of background, a military background all his life, someone who people who support Fedorov would say is basically the embodiment of the old post-Soviet military system, fighting with old methods, not effectively, not looking after soldiers, not being prioritizing human life over equipment. And there is a real sense that this is basic pushback from the old system. We've heard from Fedorov that at the beginning he had these big conflicts with Syrsky. We know that Zelenskyy refused to fire Syrsky, but then, after Fedorov, according to his own words, tried to kind of make up and cooperate with Syrsky, you then had Syrsky going to the counteroffensive and demanding that Fedorov be sacked, and that's what's now happened. There's speculation that Zelenskyy might now eventually fire Syrsky too to kind of even things out, but there is a real sense from the kind of Fedorov team and reading between the lines of what Fedorov said, that Syrsky was blocking everything he was trying to change, trying to keep things in place. And the way that is understood here in Ukraine is that it's not just about different ways of doing things, but it's also about money and corruption. And the way that the huge defense budget, obviously during wartime, this is the biggest budget, the biggest budget post in Ukraine's government finances. That is the thing that attracts a lot of attention, and that he was stopping people who had made money from procurement for a long time, stopping them carrying on making that money, and that's why he's now been forced out.
Nick, is there concern that this shake-up could affect military decision-making at a critical stage in the war?
There is great anger when you speak to people, to experts, to people who used to be in the military or who are in the mil-tech scene. They are all very frustrated and angry. They will tell you that this is a huge mistake for Zelenskyy to make, that just as Ukraine seemed to be turning the page, right? You have these daily attacks on Russia. You've seen the images, as everyone, of those huge queues outside petrol stations in Russia, Russia having to import fuel, refined fuel now because their refineries have been attacked to such a degree. We've also seen Russia's advance on the battlefield basically paralyzed because they just can't bring in the fuel and the ammunition for their frontline positions, just as things were getting better, that now basically Ukraine, Zelenskyy has taken their foot off the gas pedal, as it were, and has decided to kind of let the old system reassert itself. So there's real anger there, and I'm not sure this is over yet. The fact that we've not just having protests here in Kyiv, but also across the country, that is really not something that is normal in this country. And if you look more broadly at Ukraine's history, you've seen lots of people going out against a minister, but to have someone, have significant numbers of people going out in favour, in support of a minister, that is pretty unique.
Does this backlash actually pose any political risk then for President Zelenskyy?
I think it certainly undermines that kind of social contract, the unspoken social contract here that politics, internal politics, is something for later. The fact we haven't obviously had elections, people even who disagree with Zelensky's policies, for the most part, aren't calling for elections. They say that would be destructive during wartime, but they have agreed to basically shelve things and to look the other way in terms of lots of decisions that they might not agree with, as long as the military is getting what it needs. And I think this really risks undermining that consensus and creating a lot of tension, not just in politics, in parliament, but also in society. This is a country where you've got lots of volunteers still having to kind of support the military for all the money going to the military from the government. There are still lots of things that civil society has to pay for, find money for, help with. And there is a real kind of community there of people who feel very invested, and I don't think they're going to let it pass.
Yeah, now, Nick, several lawmakers we've been reading on Wednesday, or seven lawmakers actually this week indicated that President Zelenskyy will propose the current Interior Minister, Yuri Klimenko, as Ukraine's new Defense Minister. Is there any news on that?
So it seems like that, all the procedures are frozen for now. They're not going to rush ahead with putting him in place. Seems like there isn't the support in Parliament to do that. And also politically, it's just too toxic, I guess, as long as these protests are going on. Maybe they'll just let things kind of pause, hope that tensions kind of die down, and then they can do it once people have kind of moved on to the next topic. I'm not sure it's going to be as easy as that. If you go back to last summer, those protests against attacks by Zelensky's team on the anti-corruption bodies, that didn't die down. People did have the kind of staying power for that. But in terms of Klimenko, right, the kind of consensus opinion, at least on the square with the protesters, that this is just someone who has no track record of reforms, has no particular defense background, and will just let the system do more of the same.
Could you remind us how the war has evolved since Fedorov took over as Defense Minister?
So he is someone who is credited, obviously he's only been in the job since the beginning of the year, for really pushing those long-range attacks on Russia that have really made such an impact, not just economically on Russia's ability to make money with oil, also those internal problems created for Russia with the fuel shortages, but also in terms of the perception, right, that those strikes on Moscow, on oil facilities, even in Siberia, that is something that is cutting through, even with people like Donald Trump, who were very skeptical about Ukraine's chances and who are now actually seemingly seeing this war in a slightly different light and more willing to invest in Ukraine's future, its defense, because they see some chance for Ukraine doing better and not just relentlessly being pushed back bit by bit on the battlefield, as was the kind of narrative last year. So that's really something that's been seen as his achievement. Obviously, some of that was started before him. But also, if you talk off the record to Western European partners of Ukraine's, they say this is someone who we can work with. This is someone who's able to plan, to organize. It's not the kind of day-to-day kind of hectic organization kind of responsiveness that they saw under previous defense ministers. This is someone who has a vision and has the kind of staying power and the planning to actually make it happen. I think they are going to be very unhappy about this, and lots of the kind of recent promises of money, we don't know if they might actually happen or if they'll be delayed because of this change. In Ukraine, when the minister goes, usually the teams are purged and you have totally new people who will take months to get into the kind of detail of what was agreed. So that really is something that is very destructive and very damaging in terms of getting the resources here in a hurry to help with things like Ukraine's air defenses. We've had ballistic missiles getting through a lot worse, a lot more than previously because of those low stocks of Patriot interceptors. So that's really not a good time for turbulence and new people having to work themselves into a job that they don't know anything about.
Nick, actually, just staying with that topic of the ballistic missile attacks, because overnight at least 2 people were killed in a Russian ballistic missile attack there in the capital, Kyiv. Ukraine says it struck Russian oil tankers and other targets in the Black Sea. So both countries are still attacking key infrastructure. So just with regards to what you were saying there about how important it is as well for Ukraine, to sort of remind everyone how outside of Ukraine how much help they need, can you just sort of talk us through that a bit about what the mood is in Ukraine at the moment with regards to their relationship, we'll say, and needs from their foreign allies?
In terms of ballistic missiles, there is for now only one game in town, and that is the Patriot system, right? That is something that only the US produces, albeit Japan and Germany have licenses to produce the interceptors, but they're still totally dependent on American spare parts to make it happen. And so that is a dependence that Ukraine shares with the rest of Europe. And that is something that is very tough because people here in Kyiv got used to some level of protection, right? Not every missile was intercepted, but many were. And we've had nights in the last few weeks with 0 interceptions, all of Russia's ballistic missiles getting through. And that is, Obviously, huge damage. We've seen lots of lives lost on a scale that we kind of had not been used to for a while. But also psychologically, hearing those missiles coming in and not a single missile going out to try and stop them is tough for people. That really has changed people's perception of their own safety. In terms of general resources, so Ukraine is getting a lot more self-sufficient in terms of its kind of deep strikes, right? The ability to hit those oil facilities, for instance, in Russia. They don't just need to wait for the UK or France to send Scalp or Storm Shadow missiles. They can do it with some of their own drones or their own missiles, like the Flamingo. But in terms of that air defense, the ballistic missiles, that is something that is still totally dependent on America. They've now had those agreements in recent weeks to start trying to produce a European equivalent, basically sourcing different parts that would be needed for the missile from different producers, trying to speed this up rather than letting one manufacturer make it all happen over a longer time period. But there is a real sense that this is not the time to be wasting efforts and energies with changing people around, changing contacts. This is a time where Ukraine actually needs to just take the money that they've been promised from Western countries and actually make all this stuff happen. So there's real frustration here that these kind of personal issues between Syrskyi and Fedorov have been allowed to turn into this loss of a minister that many people thought was the best hope Ukraine had at evening things out on the battlefield and maybe turning this in Ukraine's favour.
Yeah, Nick, and I mean, as we're speaking, of course, the British Prime Minister is in Ukraine today. So, what message is this reshuffle sending to Ukraine's international partners?
Well, it's not as if the British government has had a great track record on consistency, right? Zelenskyy said goodbye to Rishi Sunak not too long ago, and I think this is a visit in a similar vein. But certainly, consistency is something that Ukraine has struggled with, and you'd have, when you speak to experts, they'll say the kind of bureaucrats in lots of these ministries stay for decades, but the ministers change every year or so and barely have time to actually understand how things work before they're moved on. And that is something that's very destructive to actually changing anything. And certainly when you speak to people from Europe who are trying to help Ukraine, there's a lot of frustration that they're often having to explain the same things 3 times a year because people get moved along and everything starts from zero. There's no institutional memory and things basically get forgotten. So that is definitely something that is destructive and that people have identified that is not a new problem. We'll see how it happens with Fedorov and his team, but usually the pattern here is if the minister goes, his closest advisors and most of his team are also pushed out and everything starts from zero.
And one final one, Nick, because if we zoom out from all of this, we focused very much on Fedorov today, but if we look at the broader cabinet reshuffle, what's being said there in Ukraine about Zelensky's priorities for the next phase of the war?
That's the million-dollar question. I think that is something that people here in Ukraine are acutely aware of, that Zelenskyy hasn't really explained why he needed to do this, why he got rid of Sudidenko, why we're now getting Koretsky, what was the problem. In a presidential system like Ukraine's, right, there is the temptation to basically throw out your prime ministers and hope that just changes things up, distracts the public and maybe improves your ratings. There is no real narrative here as to why we've had this change. In terms of the Prime Minister, Koretsky, the new Prime Minister, he is someone who comes from the energy sector, someone who has a kind of corporate credibility and a kind of back story. But some people are saying it's because he's not a politician and isn't someone who's going to have a kind of independent political following and in any way challenge Zelenskyy, but that's just one interpretation. I think if you look kind of more widely, the people who've saved their jobs, like for instance the Finance Minister, that is obviously important. Ukraine needs those ties to Western backers to keep the lights on here and to pay wages. So at least there's no change there. But certainly it just feels like lots of people being moved around without much of an explanation as to why the old people weren't doing their job and the new people are going to be better.
All right, Nick, I think we'll leave it there. Nick Connolly, DW Correspondent in Kyiv. Thanks so much. Always great to get your analysis. And that's all for now. For more analysis and on-the-ground reporting from Ukraine and around the world, make sure to subscribe to DW News and hit the like button if you found this report useful. And we'd love to hear from you. I'm Pablo Foley Elias. Thanks for watching. From me and the team here in Berlin. See you next time. Take care.